Welcome to another edition of Global Conversations. My guest tonight is Lucy Commissar. She is an investigative reporter, a journalist, who writes about corporate and financial fraud and corruption. Now, hang in there with me. All of you who follow the show know that this is not my area of expertise or competence. But I promise you, you will be interested in this show because the topic will be, according to Lucy, the greatest con man that ever lived, the infamous Bill Browder. Lucy, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, I'm really happy to have you. What I found really interesting was your own background. You started out wanting to be a teacher at a young age, and then somehow you ended up becoming a journalist. Tell us how this whole thing evolved.
Well, I started out being a teacher in high school because my mother said that's what girls do. They become teachers. You just have to pick your subject. So I picked Spanish and French because I loved and still love foreign languages. But then in college, I went to Queens College, a public university, and I got involved in the civil rights movement. I'd never done that in Long Island. I didn't know anything about civil rights, but in Queens College, they were Black students. And I got involved in the civil rights movement, got involved in picketing Woolworths against the segregation of the lunch counters. But I wanted to do more. So after my junior year, I had gone to the National Student Association congresses for a few years. Before that, I was a delegate from my college. And there was somebody there who was helping the Mississippi Free Press, which was a weekly paper promoting civil rights in Mississippi. And they needed people to work on it. And I said, I'll go. So I took a leave of absence after my junior year. I joked that was my junior year abroad and went to Mississippi. And not only did I work on the paper, but I was made the editor. And I stayed for a year. And after that, there was no question but that I would become a journalist and I would deal with issues that had to do with justice.
So what are some of the issues you covered in those years after Mississippi? And were you actually gainfully employed?
Well, no, I couldn't get a job because I remember that Tommy Zumbo, who was the head of the New York Bureau of UPI, said, I'm sorry, Lucy, we already have 3 girls. So I became a freelance. I wrote first for the Village Voice. I wrote about civil rights. I wrote what was apparently the first article on gay rights, dealing with the desegregation in terms of sexual preference of Julius's, which has just gotten a plaque and mentions that the first people that wrote about this, well, not by name, but mentioned me and the photographer from the Village Voice. And then I wrote about labor issues, labor rights. I wrote about women's rights, and that got me into what I'm doing now, because then I began to write about movements for democracy in developing countries around the world where the U.S. by chance happened to be supporting the dictator.
Well, that's really interesting. But from my perspective, it seems like quite a leap from covering civil rights issues, labor unions, women's rights, to covering big-time financial fraud and corruption. How did you make that leap?
Well, it was made for me. When I went to places in the late 80s, early 90s, I went to the Philippines, which had a movement against Marcos. I went to Zaire. I went to Haiti. And in each place, the opposition people told me the dictator has looted the country and put the money in Swiss banks. That is, in the Philippines, it was Marcos. In Zaire, it was Mobutu. In Haiti, it was the Duvalier family. I thought, what is this about the Swiss banks? I hadn't been reading in the American press about that. Well, it turned out there was an international offshore system, which has been set up by the Swiss in the 30s, And then later it was expanded by the British, who have some of the major centers, such as the Isle of Man, Guernsey, Jersey, and therefore it became part of the international financial system because, unlike what the media likes to say, shady people in sunny places running these banks, it was run by the major banks, the major world banks. And I began to look into the offshore system. Now, that got me in a funny way to Bill Browder, because in the year 2000, ironically, I'd gotten a US government research grant to look into crime in Russia. Obviously, they'd be interested in promoting that notion. But in Moscow, I went to a seminar run by a Western law firm where Browder was a speaker. In my investigations, I had already come across evidence that he was connected to a scam in which a Russian titanium company called Avisma, which he and his partners, Kenneth Dart of the Dart Cup fortune, and Francis Baker, chairman of the board of Anderson Group, which was a publicly traded investment firm in New York, had bought from Mikhail Khodorkovsky, another crook, this company. But part of the deal was to continue transfer pricing. Now, you have to know about that. They were going to do it through the Isle of Man shell company that Khodorkovsky was using. Transfer pricing is when you sell something to a fake offshore company at a fake price, which is what you report to your investors and to the tax authorities. And that company, that shell company acting for you, sells it on the market at the real price, a much bigger price, and you get to skim the profits. And that's what Khodorkovsky was doing. And part of the deal, and it was actually written in documents that I was able to get, was that the new owners, Browder and his co-owners, Dart and Baker, were going to get the same deal. They were going to continue the transfer pricing. What was funny about this was when they sold it to a company called VSMPO, which is an acronym for a Russian company that uses titanium in its products, and it wanted to have the titanium, the raw titanium. Part of the deal was that they were going to continue the rake-off. However, when VSMPO bought them, a lawyer who's a Philadelphia lawyer named Bruce Marks, who also had an office in Moscow, looked into the documentation of this company on behalf of his client, VSMPO. And the documentation was in London, in the lawyer for Avisma. And later he said to me, Lucy, I could not believe that this lawyer let me look at the documents, because the documents said, we cheated. He said, my client, we cheated Avisma because of the transfer pricing. So he sued them, Dart and Browder and Baker, in New Jersey under the RICO statute. That's a statute against mobsters, against criminal enterprises. Well, they settled. What could they do? Because he got the documents where they said, this is the deal. We are going to continue raking off the profits through transfer pricing. They had to settle. So I knew that Browder was a crook. And I brought up this case, and he attacked me at this meeting saying,
Lucy, can I jump in just for a second? The one thing that's really puzzling for me is I've been living in Russia for 3 years now, almost 3 years, and I've been here every year since 2017. I know there's a bureaucracy. I know that secrecy is a big thing. How on earth did you, as a foreigner, and I think are you an American?
Yes.
Yeah. How did you, as an American, come to Russia and be able to find these documents? I mean,
well, I didn't get them. I didn't get them in Russia. I got them through Bruce Marks, who's a lawyer, a Philadelphia lawyer. And we had a lot of conversation, and he gave me access to the documents. In fact, I spent a whole day going through boxes of documents. And so that was how I got them. So it wasn't in Russia, but I knew about the case, and this was before I had written about it. And he just denied it and he said, oh, whenever anybody attacks me, I know it's because I am attacking the corrupt system in Russia, except he was the corrupt guy. And then in the coffee break, when I talked to some of the reporters, and they laughed and laughed because they knew he was a crook. They knew Khodorkovsky was a crook who had set up the deal, and they knew he was a crook. So I wrote about this for 100 Reporters. It was published in 2014. It took a long while to get anybody to run it. The mainstream media was not interested. And then I started looking further into Browder because I realized he was a crook. And I spent a couple of years pulling together the documentation. And I wrote about it again for 100 Reporters because the mainstream press in the US practices censorship when it comes to articles, which suggests that anybody who attacks the Russians is a crook. And that's how I ended up writing that story. That was published in 2017. So that's 5 years ago, and Browder's still going around pretending to be the white knight.
So, as you're probably aware, and I'm wondering, how much time did you spend in Russia on that trip?
Oh, only a few weeks, not very long, or maybe it was a month. I forget now. The information did not come from Russia. The information both for Avisma and for the Magnitsky story, which I'll talk about much more in detail, came from documents, mostly from court documents, mostly from U.S. court documents, sworn court documents. I work mostly from documents, and I talk to people to deal with some of the specifics, but my stories are always solidly grounded in documents, and particularly in sworn legal documents from the U.S. court system.
Okay, so to be clear, because I'm having a hard time following this legal stuff, because that's not anywhere in my expertise. Why was Browder or others involved in the court system? Were they being prosecuted? Were they being investigated? What the heck was going on there?
Okay, I think I need to do a primer for people who don't know about this case or Browder or his Magnitsky hoax, and they don't know about it because, of course, the mainstream media doesn't write about it, and not too much. Not the progressive media also, for the most part, doesn't write about it. So this is to get you on the first page of understanding the story. How does it start? It starts when William Browder goes to Russia in the late 90s with $25 million from Edmund Safra and Benny Steinmetz. Now, Edmund Safra was the owner of Republic National Bank, and there was some the IMF $4.8 billion IMF loan that was supposed to go to Russia in 98 was going through Republic Bank, and it disappeared. People wonder about that. Benny Steinmetz has since been indicted and found guilty for bribery in I think in Guinea, but it was a bribery for getting a contract for metal exploitation, and he was found guilty. Okay, so let's and Safra, by the way, died a number of years ago, but let's say both of them were, their reputations I would put as dicey, if not. Steinmetz is obviously very crooked. Safra, there's indication that he was also crooked. They set up the Hermitage Fund, and Browder was really the face of it. It wasn't really his fund. In the end, he bought them out, but he keeps saying he founded it, but actually they founded it, and he was the face of it. And it was an offshore operation set up in Guernsey. And by the way, Safra held the shares of this company, set it up through Guernsey, through Republic Investments in Guernsey, and it was set up by the infamous Mossack Fonseca. And the Steinmetz also had his shares of this company set up in Guernsey, and therefore they were really the owners. But then, what was Browder doing with their money? And later it would be money that he controlled, his money. He bought and sold shares in Russian stocks. Now, to evade taxes, he set up shell companies in Kalmykia. A shell company, as indicated, is a company that doesn't do anything except move and launder assets. It doesn't produce, it doesn't own anything, doesn't produce anything. It doesn't make toothbrushes. It doesn't. It's not an IT company. It's just a money and asset moving hiding company. So Kalmykia is a region of Russia, which you probably know about, where the majority are Buddhists. And they gave tax breaks to companies that hired 50% of their workers that were disabled. And they could be disabled for many reasons. Some of them were veterans of the Afghanistan war. But Browder lied and paid workers, manual laborers, gardeners, to say they worked for his shell, which had no employees. It was just a asset laundering holding shell. But in the early 2000s, the Russians got wise and they investigated, and they found he had failed to pay $40 million in taxes they ordered him to pay. He would not pay. First, he bribed an investigator to knock off the charge, a local, but the investigator later recanted, and the feds, the Russian federal officials, tax officials, they picked up the case. So in 2007, the tax inspectors got warrants to search offices of Hermitage and his accountant, which was Firestone Duncan, which employed Sergei Magnitsky, who handled the Hermitage account and who had set up the fake employment deals. They were looking for records of some of Browder's companies. They were called, these shells were Ryland, Parthenian, and Macon. They seized the corporate stamps, the charters, the tax and registration certificates. Parthenian, as an example, had been created out of Saturn and some of the other companies Browder had after Saturn was bankrupted in order to evade Russian taxes, part of this whole scam. So they were set up in the classic offshore layering system. Layering is one layer over another over another. It's hard to find, to hide ownership and dodge taxes. So the companies in Kalmykia were owned by Cypriot companies, Glendora and Cone, which were legally owned by an HSB trust, HSBC Bank, but they were beneficially owned by Browder's Hermitage Fund. The structure was created so that the money could be remitted to Cyprus, to shareholders in Guernsey, with little or no taxes along the way. And they were owned by Glendora and Cone. So the profits would get cashed out in Guernsey to end in the offshore, in the coffers of the offshore investors of the Hermitage Fund and HSBC. This is classic layering. And this would also hide the fact that Browder owned and controlled the Russian companies, since the names Hermitage and Browder were not listed in any of the company registration. They were hidden. They used fake names, company names. Sometimes the names of owners, the so-called owners, are people who work in the company that set up the shell company. They use their names. Well, so that is ongoing. The tax issue is ongoing, and Browder isn't paying. In the end of 2005, he has gone out of the country, out of Russia, and comes back. The Russians will not renew his visa. Well, he's a tax evading crook. Why should they renew his visa? He would later say that it was Putin because he's Putin's enemy number one. I don't think the president of a country deals with tax evaders, even 40 million. That's not what a president does, but that's what he would say, and that's what all the Western press would write. So let's go to the next scam. This is the tax refund fraud. It started in July 2007. Browder is in London, but he's left some people there. Magnitsky is still there. There was a scam that some people, some scam artists, hired out to do this for other companies. I spoke to one of the scam artists. His name is Andrei Pavlov, and I spoke to him over hours of interviews, which I taped. He admitted he took part in it. And by the way, this was in New York. He had come to New York, and I taped it in person, so he knew I was taping it. It was with his permission. A company would set up fake shells. There we go again with the shells. The shells would sue the company saying, you failed to carry out a contract, and that cost me this amount of money. The company would say, yes, we will pay, and then it will tell the Russian Treasury, we had to restate our income because we had to pay out this money, and therefore we need to get a refund on our taxes because we didn't make that much money. Pavlov told me the case would require a lot of detailed information from the company's books for the year. And he said he didn't know who was behind the operation. He was working for a middle guy in this scam, but all the evidence said it had to be an insider. Nobody would understand all those books. So Hermitage went according to the playbook, said it had to pay $1 billion to these shell companies, and demanded that $320 million in taxes paid be refunded. Browder says the Hermitage shells were stolen, that somebody else was doing this, was making these, was paying out this money, was in collusion with these fake claims. However, he said the investigators who searched his office in June of 2007 had taken documents they used to re-register the companies. That's impossible. I talked to some lawyers in Moscow by email. The only way to change ownership of a Russian company is for the owner to go in person to the company's house, or for a person with the power of attorney to request it. Now, could you imagine if anybody could steal some documents in an office and then take over a company by saying, I have these documents, this is now my company? The documents show, other documents show, that a Cyprus shell, which was the owner of Browder's Kalmykia shells, gave power of attorney to an Oktay Gasanov. Now, it was an inside deal. When an operator in the deal, this was the key middleman, Viktor Klebnikov, who ended up in jail for a number of years, he testified in court. He said he had worked with a Sergei Leonidovich. Well, that would be Sergei Leonidovich Magnitsky, who supplied the documents they needed. And that Gasanov was his collaborator. And I have a copy of a bill of sale with Gasanov's name, and it goes to a figurehead owner they are supposedly selling these companies to another owner. Now, Browder says he didn't know about the case while it was going on, but there are document receipts filed in a federal court case in New York, which show that legal letters from the court were received in July at the mailbox that Magnitsky would access as the accountant for Hermitage. And Pavlov said that was July. Pavlov told me there was a hearing in Russia in October, and on this case, which is fake case, Hermitage sent no one to the hearing. They didn't complain at all until after the money was paid out in December, because all the evidence points to Hermitage, their team, as the crooks in the deal. So that is what Browder is trying to block. He's trying to block his responsibility for these two big scams. Now, Magnitsky, he said, was a whistleblower in that scam. But that's a lie, because Rima Starova, she was a woman on a pension, and she'd been paid to be the hired name of a shell company called Boyle Systems, and that was set up in the British Virgin Islands to take over the shell companies that Markelov used in the deal. He would get layering again. She saw an item in Kommersant, Russian economics newspaper, about an investigation of Hermitage shell companies. She was afraid the trail would lead to her. So in April of 2008, she went to the police. She told them about the fake re-registration of companies, the falsification of debt. And Hermitage put out a press release that month, which they later knocked down, but it is preserved by the Wayback Machine, and which said that she had gone to the Interior Ministry and made false accusations. Magnitsky, who Browder says was the whistleblower, didn't even mention this scam till 6 months later, in October of 2008. In testimony he was summoned to give, didn't go voluntarily, and Browder lies that he accused tax investigators in the scam, and the testimony is filed in federal court. It's very easy to prove that Browder is a liar, if, of course, any Western media cared to do so. So, do you have any questions about that, or I will go on to the next part?
I do. I want to clarify a couple of things. First of all, was it known that Browder owned Hermitage?
Yes. That's the
Okay.
Hermitage. It was known.
Okay. And so when these denouncements came from Hermitage in press releases or whatever, Browder had to be the one behind that, correct?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now, the other thing I want to clarify is Sergei Magnitsky. Um, what was he? Was he a bookkeeper? Was he a CPA? Was he an auditor? What was his professional background and real function?
All of that. In fact, I have a copy of in Russian of a diploma. He went to an economics college, which taught him accounting. And in his first, in all of his depositions, his interrogations with the tax inspectors, when they ask for a profession, he is listed as an auditor with Firestone Duncan. There's not even a question that that's what he was. He was an auditor, an accountant.
Okay. So he handled all of this stuff for Browder. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Now, Browder is calling him a whistleblower. Is that correct?
That's correct, but that is not true because it was Rima Starova who went in April of 2008. She was the shell. She was the hired name of a shell company called Boyley Systems, set up in the British Virgin Islands to take over the shell companies that Markelov had used in the tax refund fraud. She saw an article in Commerçant about the investigation. She was afraid the trail would lead to her. She went to the police. She told them what had gone on. And Hermitage, in their press release, actually admits that. So we know that it was Rima Starova, and it was filed in U.S. federal court, Southern District of New York. We have her testimony, both in Russian and translation into English. That was clear. So the investigators knew a lot. And
Okay.
so,
So what I want to follow now, and so it's clear to me and my viewers, here's Magnitsky taking the fall, really, being accused of being a whistleblower. He's not feeling too good about this, I'm sure. What's interesting is that later on, Browder is defending this guy. Isn't that correct?
yes. So in the beginning, Magnitsky was interrogated in 2006 about the tax evasion. Browder is already in the UK. Then in November of 2008, so that's really about a year or so later, he's detained for investigation because all the Hermitage executives have left for London, and they discover that the investigators, that I guess have their ways, I think he needed a visa. He had been working to arrange going to London, and they figured he's not coming back. The European Court of Human Rights, which is in Europe, not in Russia, determined that he was arrested for just cause because of that he was about to leave the country. And all the time he was in prison, Browder said not one word about him, not that he is suffering, made no effort to free him. He could have freed him, of course, by just paying the taxes because he was just detained for investigation. He could have freed him in a heartbeat. And in prison, Magnitsky met Alec Lurie, an investigative journalist. He was there because a corrupt Duma member had accused him of extortion. And Lurie, who I happened to meet in the year 2000 in Moscow, we were both looking into the disappearance of the $4.8 billion IMF loan to Russia. So I knew him. He would be exonerated and the prosecutor would apologize. But meanwhile, Magnitsky met Lurie in a room where prisoners waited while they were being sent to court or for other reasons. And that's they could mix with other prisoners. He told him his employers were working to get him out. Sometime later, Magnitsky saw Lurie again, and he said his employers were selling him out. Lurie testified to this in a deposition filed in U.S. federal court in the Southern District of New York. So then we get to the death. So let's say that he did nothing to help Magnitsky while he was still alive, and when maybe he could have. He did nothing. Well, he could have if he paid the taxes. He'd rather keep the cash. So then we get to Magnitsky's death. He died of pancreatitis, which was badly treated. Not, I would say, worse than prisoners get in places like Mississippi and Alabama medical facilities. It's pretty much of a par. But Browder said in talks with Chatham House, to Chatham House in London, and to the San Diego Law School, and these are on video or in text provided by those institutions, that Magnitsky had been left alone in a cell and had died. Full stop. That's all. He didn't know how he had died. Well, meanwhile, there's another scam that had been going on. Browder the Russians discovered the illicit buyer of millions of dollars worth of shares of Gazprom, the major energy company, that buying them in Russia. It was supposed to be only for nationals. Others had to get them at higher prices in London as ADRs, that means American Depository Receipts, and they could get fewer of them. So Browder set up his favorite shell companies with fake Russian owners to buy the shares. Some of them were for himself and some for the Ziff brothers, who were his major clients. They were heirs of the U.S. Ziff media fortune, and they were also big-time donors to the Democrats. So, but so far, nothing is happening about, how did Magnitsky die? He just died. They didn't take care of him. Well, but the Russians are still going after Browder for tax evasion and now for the illicit buys of Gazprom. In 2011, which is a couple of years after the death of Magnitsky, there is a man named Jonathan Weiner. He's a former State Department official, and he hooks up with Browder. They invent the story that Magnitsky had been beaten to death with 8 thugs wielding batons over the course of more than an hour. There were 2 problems with the story. First, the Russian Public Oversight Commission for Human Rights is a non-governmental organization that monitors prison conditions. They had gone in immediately after the death of Magnitsky. They did an investigation. Their report, which is online in Russian and English, includes notes by attending doctors and did not leave an hour when he was unattended and anyone could have beaten him up. It starts 6:30, review by the doctor on duty. Then Magnitsky is hospitalized to the surgery department. 7 p.m., the patient talks to voices and shouts that somebody is trying to kill him. An emergency doctor is called. The antispasm therapy is not possible because of his aggressive behavior. These are all in the medical notes. At 9:15, a psychiatrist is examining Magnitsky when he loses consciousness. They use indirect heart massage and ventilation of lungs with something called an AMBU pillow, AMBU. Maybe doctors will know about that. I hadn't heard about that. Then he is transferred to a room for artificial ventilation of lungs and hormone injection. But at 9:50, the patient dies. So between 9:15 and 9:50, he was getting treatment, and there was not an hour for the 8 imaginary thugs to enter the room. Browder gave this report from the Public Oversight Commission to the Physicians for Human Rights in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in hopes that they would back up his story. They didn't. They didn't contradict the Public Oversight Commission. And by the way, Andrei Nekrasov, the Russian filmmaker who did the brilliant documentary, who you have seen, The Magnitsky Act Behind the Scenes, found that 8 people could not fit in the cell. Plus, forensic photos showed no marks on Magnitsky's body, only on his ankles and wrist. So with the 8 thugs during 1 hour aiming only for his ankles and wrists, in fact, those black and blue marks were explained by his banging against the cell door. But Browder is very good at lying and also at forgeries. For example, the death certificate, which he distributed to many in the U.S., he underlined, quote, in the death certificate, closed craniocerebral injury, question mark, and he blurred the, quote, no signs of a violent death detected, unquote. In fact, Magnitsky's medical record showed a concussion from a fall 16 years earlier. That's the closed injury, and his mother testified to that, but Browder is a liar.
So, Lucy, let me jump in because you mentioned Andrei Nekrasov and his fabulous film. I met him in 2018, I think it was, in St. Petersburg. I interviewed him, found him fascinating. We became friends, and he gave me a copy of the Magnitsky Act behind the scenes. It's not available for free anywhere online. The trailer is there,
I
but
think it is. I think it is now available for free. I have found it.
I was looking for it today, and I couldn't find it.
I will send you the link so you can put it in notes to this our discussion.
Yeah, I would really like that because I think it's an incredible film that is only going to give credence to everything you're saying. I think he did a brilliant job, and he says it in the film, but he told me this when he started making the film, that was not his intention to expose this as a crime or fraud. He just wanted to find out what happened to this Magnitsky guy, and then started investigating, like you and a lot of other people, and discovered the whole thing. So um, let's continue with this. Now, this Browder, you have called the greatest con man ever.
Mm-hmm.
He's already been conning a lot of people out of money. He's been conning Russians uh, out of a lot of money. I think you probably have some information on how much he owes the Russian government today in taxes and interest. But he goes back to the United States, and then not only with this death certificate, but he started lying about all kinds of things. Bring us up to speed, because he eventually gets to somebody in the United States Congress and sells them a bill of goods. Uh, Tell us about that.
Well, there are some people that were sold a bill of goods, and some people were, I would say, willing co-conspirators, were complicit because they know. Uh, so the, the Browder hoax fits in perfectly with the U.S. government, deep state, congressional policy of demonizing Russia. Uh, it has been promoted by the so-called liberal congressman, Democrat Jim McGovern, and his office. It's one of the co-sponsors of the Magnitsky Act. Uh, his office refuses to provide any evidence for the claims in the Magnitsky Act. In fact, I met him at a meeting of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, of which I'm a member, and he was walking around the room shaking everybody's hand, being the politician. Most speakers don't do that; they just stay at the podium. So took advantage of that and said, "So, Representative McGovern, you're a co-sponsor of the Magnitsky Act, and it talks about Magnitsky being murdered, and says a lot of things about uh, sanctions against people who are complicit, and the people who have been sanctioned are people like the tax investigators, the judges who found Browder later guilty of tax evasion. What evidence do you have for any of the claims you made about Magnitsky, about Browder?" And he said, well, his aide was there. He said, give her where she can contact somebody. So he gave me the name of somebody who works for a committee, who said to me, basically, Lucy, you have asked me for this before, and I'm not sending you any information. McGovern is not stupid. He knows there's no information. He knows he's lying. He finds it convenient to lie. So I don't consider these people conned. I consider them co-conspirators. The other person is a Senator Cardin in the Senate, and he also they will not answer any request for information. And then there was the there have been some Republicans. Interesting that Bernie Sanders voted against the Magnitsky Act. Elizabeth Warren was not then in the Senate. But it's very easy to check out the lies. It's very easy, but they don't want it, and there is no way you can say they believe this because of evidence. So that's really the problem that I have.
So
All
So,
the evidence is there. When I contact the State Department, because they are promoting this act, and they have a human rights report which repeats some of these lies, I said, can you give me evidence for some of the things you have said? You know what the answer was when I preserved the email, which I should frame? The answer was, we do a lot of research. Thank you. Full stop. There is no evidence. It's a complete fabrication on all sides. The people that are conned are probably ordinary Americans who read articles in the newspapers. They are conned. I cannot believe that the writers for the newspapers are conned, because in over 20 cases, and I stopped doing it after a while, in major media, it's the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Vanity Fair, somebody wrote something, and I sent them back a note with links saying, look, you said this is not true. This is a link to the deposition filed in U.S. federal court. You said this is not true. They do not answer. The only person that answered was a reporter from a paper in Cyprus. I sent him this information, and he ended up actually writing a story, not in his paper, but in the Duran, which said, I really hate to write a story like this, because I have to say I was basically snookered. I wrote things that were not true. I was very busy. The editor wanted something right away, and Browder seemed like such a nice guy. And then he looked at the documents and said, it's not true. Everything that he told me was not true. If people want to look at my website, is called thecommissarscoop.com. They look at the Commissar Scoop, Komisar Scoop, they will find this. It's called 20 Fake Stories, but there are many other. There's a whole section on the front page, homepage, called the Browder hoax. And if you go down there, you will find the major stories I have written about William Browder. The other interesting part is he's very litigious. He threatens. One reason that Andrei Nekrasov's film hasn't been in the U.S. or in venues in Europe is because he threatens lawsuits. Of course, he's not going to go ahead with it. He threatens lawsuits. Has he threatened me with a lawsuit? You better believe no. I would love to get him on the stand under oath and ask him about all his lies. He wouldn't dare. He wouldn't dare do that. So the people, the interests who are not writing the truth, it's not because they're afraid of lawsuits. It's because they're complicit in the con game, and it's a con game against the American and the world's public.
yeah, I want to go back to the Browder hoax that fit, you said, perfectly with the U.S. deep state, the government, the congressional policy of demonizing Putin. I want to ask you this. Do you think that Browder had some significant responsibility in the following Russophobia in the Hillary Clinton, Putin did it, they stole the election? Do you think his lies were part of the foundation for any of that?
The Browder hoax is, because it was 2012, is the first pillar of Russiagate. And that's followed by fake stories by the Directorate of National Intelligence, where they talk about attempts of Russia to influence the election of 2016. And then in the last page, they say, but we have no evidence. What? The whole long story, but we have no evidence. It's part of the Mueller investigation. One of the main points he said, he had 5 main points. One of them was the Trump Tower meeting. That's also part of the Browder. And then he repeats all the Browder hoax stuff, and he never goes into the existing documentation, which shows that it's a fake. Now, the story of that is interesting as well. It was that Natalia Veselnitskaya was the lawyer for Prevezon. Prevezon is a Russian company, real estate investor company, that was a fall guy. There have been a lot of Browder victims. There are probably close to half a dozen. I'll be writing about that too. There are a couple interesting cases coming up. That was one of the victims. He accused them of having received some of the $230 million stolen from the Russian treasury. Initially, he said, and it was stolen from his companies, but it's not true. His companies, he admitted in one of the fake books he wrote, was had no assets. He had moved them all out of the country. But that was the first thing he said, and it was actually repeated by Catherine Belton, who's a fake reporter who was writing for I think at that time for the Financial Times. She recently wrote a book which her publishers had to apologize for because she had a lot of fake stuff in there with no evidence. She was actually sued, and they had to say, well, no, there's no evidence on this. So she's one of the Browder acolytes who is one of his stenographers. So what happened in this case, in the Prevezon case, there was the Justice Department acting as a proxy for, and this was Preet Bharara. Also, when I was on I keep on interrupting myself, but there was a Preet Bharara, who says he's a big friend of Browder, had him on his a program which was streamed, and I started to ask questions, and they blocked me. I do save the document on the screen that says you have been blocked. That's if you ask questions. Preet Bharara brought this case. He was the U.S. attorney, that's a federal attorney for New York. The district, it's Southern District of New York. New York is broken into numerous districts because there are so many cases. He brought this case as a proxy for Browder, accusing Prevezon of having gotten some of this money, except he had no evidence. I went to the pre-trial hearings, and the judge laughed when the Justice Department showed some evidence. You have to ask judges permission to put evidence into the case to show to the jury. And he showed them this evidence, which supposedly was how the money moved. And the judge said, well, this might be good for modern art, but it's not going to convince anybody. They were just lines on a page. There's no evidence there. So anyway, the Justice Department brought the case, would not stop the case. In the end, Prevezon had to settle for $6 million because it was costing them a lot of money just to defend the case, and the Justice Department has deep pockets. And that was the end of the case. If the Justice Department had a real case, they would not have settled for anything. They would go on until they could prove this is what happened to that $200 million. And this guy got some of it. They could not prove it. They had zero evidence. And what happened was really interesting. I saw a paper by somebody who was an expert in tracing money, and he looked at the documents that they claimed were proof. And he said, but there are spaces in between, like money goes from A to B, then there's nothing about where it goes from C, but it is picked up at E, and therefore it must be that money. This is a New York expert filed a paper, and there was no case because you have to show the money moved from the Treasury all the way to the account of Prevezon. They could not show it, and that's why they settled. It was a fake case, but still, Natalia Veselnitskaya was the lawyer and was rather upset about what Browder had done. And so she wanted to tell the Trump campaign people she wanted to talk to them, and she wanted them to end this case and to tell them the truth about what was going on. But what happened was there was some money. As I indicated before, the Ziff brothers had gotten some of the money from the illicit Gazprom buys. They gave a lot of money to the Democrats. There was a person that was helping Veselnitskaya get the money, who was not really, well, I would say not very smart, but he was an entertainment lawyer, and they expand on things maybe. He told the Trumps, in order to get the meeting, that she had information about illicit money going to Hillary. Well, she didn't say that. She said that the Ziffs got illicit money from Gazprom, and the money went to the Democrats. And that's true. That can be proved. But that's what it was about. As soon as the meeting happened, and Trump Jr. found out she didn't have any dirt on Hillary, which she had never said she did, he walked out of the meeting. The meeting was over. And you can find out what happened in the meeting, because one of the people at the meeting was Manafort, who was a high campaign person, and he took notes of everything in the meeting. And those notes were made available to investigators, and I got a copy of the notes, and it actually says everything that was said. And when Veselnitskaya also gave testimony to a Senate investigating committee, she said the exact same thing. It just followed the notes. It followed everything I have told you. But of course, Browder tries to make it into a big example of a Putin attack. Well, it had nothing to do with Putin. It had to do with Veselnitskaya and her client, and her feeling that her clients were shafted, which I think is the case. But so that's one story leads into another. But besides that, then there were the imaginary hack of the DNC. Remember, the DNC computer was hacked, and that showed how the DNC had really improperly, illicitly sandbagged Bernie Sanders. Money that was supposed to go to both candidates, they just sent to Hillary. I mean, they basically sandbagged him. Well, then they wouldn't let the FBI or any government agency look at the computers. They gave them to a private company called CrowdStrike. Now, there a guy named Adam Schiff, a congressman from California, held hearings, secret hearings, in his intelligence committee, and asked Sean Henry, who's the head of CrowdStrike, about the Russians getting into these DNC computers. And Sean Henry said, we don't know who, he used the word exfiltrated, we don't know who exfiltrated the emails. We don't know who. Do you think that was public? No. Schiff and the Democrats continued to lie that the Russians had done it. And it was a year and a half till Adam Schiff made public that hearing in which Sean Henry says, we don't know who exfiltrated the emails. So there was just one after another of what I call the pillars of Russiagate, and the Browder hoax was the first pillar of Russiagate.
This is incredible. A lot of people will remember a lot of what you just detailed. But the thing that really you've impressed upon me is how profoundly this William Browder has affected the United States of America. Affected not only that election, had a terrible impact on that, but has added maybe as much or more than anybody to the Russophobia, to the falsification of information about Russia, to the lies. He probably has done more than anybody to affect the culture and the psyche of the American people. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yes, and he is constantly on TV in the U.S., in Europe, quoted in newspapers, lying, and nobody ever checks anything out. They check. I mean, part of the scandal to me is the corruption of the media, either a combination of corruption, laziness, incompetence. My favorite phrase about doing investigative journalism was a sign in the Chicago City News Bureau. I think it was back in the 40s. And the sign was, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. That has to be what investigative journalists live by. But the journalists here live by, if it says something bad about Russia or Putin, don't bother to check it out, just write it. And that, unfortunately, what's happened to the press. There's the degradation of the American media. That's what we're living through. It's very sad as a journalist. I mean, the worst example, of course, is the imprisonment of Julian Assange, he should be getting the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. He should be getting every award because he is the most courageous journalist that right now in our time, and he is kept in terrible imprisonment. The UN rapporteur says it's akin to torture uh, because he is actually a truth teller instead of a liar. We're in a very sad place in journalism in the West.
Yeah. Well, we've got just a few minutes left. I want to conclude this story um, in Russia. Of course, the United States is never going to extradite him to Russia. That's for sure. But I know that he's been convicted of fraud in Russia.
Hmm.
Um, and I think, well, bring us up to date on that as we close. What is he being accused of?
Well, he was
Uh,
convicted of tax fraud and also the illicit. And then they add the. I think they're still going after him on the conviction was in 2013. I think they may still be going after him on the Gazprom case. So the case is not closed; it's ongoing. It's and it's to me, the importance is to get the information uh, available to people that want it. When I find these things, I publish it on my website. If people want to follow the story, go to thecommissarscoop.com and also on Twitter at Lucy Commissar. And thank you, Twitter, for reviving free speech on Twitter, because the only way I get my information now is through some websites and links from Twitter. Mostly when I read the mainstream press, I just have to see what the propaganda is today. I really can't take any of it seriously. It's a very sad state to be in.
well, I certainly agree with you on what journalism has become uh, in the West, anyway, the United States. But to uh, to satisfy my last question, so to be clear, has Browder been convicted? Has he been indicted, convicted? And how much money does Russia claim he owes the Russian people?
He was convicted in 2013 on the tax evasion charges. Now the sum seems to go up north of $100 million when you include the tax evasion and you include the fake purchase of the Gazprom shares. So it's north of $100 million, and it's they're never going to collect, but Browder is using this. He has put aside a lot. He must have a major PR operation. And by the way, initially, when Khodorkovsky was jailed for his corruption in transfer pricing the Yukos money, that's the same tactic. Browder said that was just fine. He's really glad. Then he made friends with Khodorkovsky, and Khodorkovsky spent 300 million. Was it 300 million or 300,000? I have to take a look what the money was. He spent a lot of money supporting the Magnitsky Act, and this was actually, he had to report this in documents. So we know that he spent money doing. And the Magnitsky Act, by the way, specifically mentions Khodorkovsky. He got what he paid for. Specifies him as a victim of attacks by the Russians. Khodorkovsky, a convicted tax evader, and the documents are all there. Everything is there. But as long as you're against Putin, that's a get out of jail free card. And if you're crook, it doesn't really matter. They're really, both of those cases are very close. I mean, I found out in the Avisma case they were connected, and now you find out now that they are connected, working in this anti-Russian campaign. So it's and it's all, a lot of it is organized by an American-based public relations company called, I think it's APOC, um, a public relations company that first worked for Khodorkovsky and now works for both of them. And this is what they do. They can create fake news, and it is picked up by the media. And this is what people are getting. This is what people are getting. They're really getting. So I have to laugh whenever I hear stuff about fake news. There's nobody as good at putting on fake news as the media. It would be really interesting to see. And by the way, when I have sent this information to some of the big groups that supposedly look at fake news, Swopes and some of the others, Nobody answers me. There's an article someplace. I say, look, this is fake. This is not true. Here's the information. They don't even answer me. So I think all these fake news sites are basically set up to promote the fake news of the system, because they don't even say, well, we checked it out. We really don't agree with you. The Poynter Institute is another big one, runs some of these fake news investigating sites. They're fake themselves. They're fake themselves. This becomes surreal. This becomes 1984 land. We are living in 1984 land.
Yeah, it really is a dystopian period that we're living in. I want to close by saying this. I'm going to post your website in the description. I spent quite a bit of time there in the last couple of days, and I've got to hand it to you. It's jam-packed with information that people need to know. I'm happy that maybe I'm doing just a tiny little bit to help get this word out, Lucy, that you've been working so hard at for so long. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure.